So, rehabilitation in the COVID era, that is the topic of today. It has pretty much become based on the coronavirus, past, present and future. Everybody's the same in this context. It's been a bit of a journey. This is what we'll be talking about today. We'll give a brief introduction to who we are. We'll give a bit of a service and product update, but we're not going to dwell on that. And I suggest if people want more information on that, we'll get together by organisation and do that in smaller groups. A lot about what we've done to remain active during this pandemic and how we plan our future. And as an example of how we have provided services, because they are so important in this context, we're going to focus on psychology, and Karen is going to talk a bit about that. But let's first of all remember who we are and where we come from. So Pace Rehabilitation is a private company that is providing a coordinated multidisciplinary service for individuals who have sustained limb loss and or serious limb injury to reclaim their lives following life-changing events. I think it's fair to say that most of our caseload is trauma patients. We have two clinics. One is in Bredbury now. It was established in Cheadle in 2003. And we opened the second one in Chesham, Buckinghamshire, 2008. We moved a couple of years ago to larger premises in Bredbury that we're very pleased with. And in 2019, last year, we also moved from Chesham to Amersham to have bigger premises down south. We did have plans to establish satellite provision during the spring in Glasgow with a fellow clinician up there who's called David Morrison. You may know him if you're involved in prosthetic provision within our environment. But obviously, for now, that sort of thing is on hold. Looking a bit closer at our caseload, not because we intended it that way when we started, but it was just the environment we lived in. We mostly see people who have suffered serious trauma or illness. It's not the same population as you would normally associate with amputation and those conditions within the NHS. They tend to be of working age, they're active, they have life responsibilities. They're often involved in litigation because that's how a lot of our treatment is funded through third-party insurance policies. So they are people who are caregivers rather than care receivers, which is kind of the opposite to many NHS patients that we come across with amputation, who are at the end of their lives and they are receivers of care rather than givers of care. So our people tend to have responsibilities for friends, family that they have to deal with, in addition to going through the rehabilitation and re-establishing their lives. It could be after this that this changes a little bit, I think. I'm not too sure. We have talked about it, but the reality is that when the NHS gets back into some kind of normality, they'll have a huge backlog in the type of services that we normally provide. And it may be that people see the need to opt out of those services more than they did before. It's just a thought, but it may be that our patient cohort changes a little bit at the end of this. So because we're involved in litigation environment and we provide services within that environment, our scope of practice is also different from that of the NHS clinicians. As an NHS clinician, typically the scope of practice is to get somebody upright, get them mobile, get them out of hospital, get them safe home, and to function in some capacity. And that's good, and I have no problem with that at all. Our scope of practice is a little bit different in that we often work towards the rehabilitation code in the litigation environment, which says that the personal injury claims process is to install the individual as much as possible to the position they were in before the accident. So that means if they were working before, they should be working again if possible. If they were riding a mountain bike before, they should be doing that again. If they were scuba diving, they should be doing that again, and so on and so forth. So we have a higher bar, if you like, than the NHS system in terms of trying to achieve an outcome. We want to go a little bit further than most NHS clinics and facilities have the opportunity to do. So that's our scope of practice, and I suppose because we do that all day, every day, we're quite used to that and we feel comfortable in that environment, and we are, false modesty, we might even say that we're quite good at it. When we see people initially, we have different types of assessment when we get the referral. I'm just going to skip through this because I know a lot of you will be aware of this already, but we will typically provide either an immediate needs assessment or a prosthetic free of charge assessment or an orthotic initial assessment. The way these things are structured is linked to the costs involved with them. So an immediate needs assessment is provided for a fixed fee. We do that when a detailed clinically reasoned report is necessary to justify and to access funding. A free of charge assessment, we will provide that when the focus is on the examination and the cost, and we don't actually need to provide a big report justifying what we do. There are other people providing reports in that scenario, and we're just expected to get on with the job when somebody authorises the cost involved with the treatment. And then we also provide orthotic initial assessments. Typically 1 or 2 clinicians, depending on how complex the presentation is, and they are most of the time related to lower limb trauma rehabilitation, and quite regularly related to pre-amputation situations where it could be that somebody's thinking about an amputation, but they haven't quite explored all the options yet. You will also know, possibly some of you at least, that for our sins we provide medical legal reports. Some of the clinicians, certainly not all of us, we do that within the sphere of prosthetics, orthotics, physiotherapy and rehabilitation medicine. It's not a focus of what we do, but absolutely it keeps us in touch with our referrers, and it's a good skill to have for some of us as well. So those are the areas we get involved with. That's PACE. My next section in this presentation now is going to be a handful of video clips, and I'm going to run a couple of them, but not many. This is one of the areas that we were going to talk to people about when we were going around updating our referrers and our stakeholders and our activities. It is just a fact that over the years we have become more and more early involved with people's rehabilitation, to the point where we're seeing very regularly primary amputees, and we're also seeing people before they have their amputation. That's a really, really good thing. And if you take that back even a little bit further, we're seeing people who are thinking about having an amputation, but they haven't quite made that call yet. And that's resulted in us establishing quite an elaborate multidisciplinary orthotic service, where we provide orthotic devices that are, if you like, a final attempt at making sure that an individual has explored all their options before undergoing an amputation. And it may be that those interventions actually result in the amputation not taking place. I'm just going to play this little video, which is like a before and after scenario. It will be jerky and it's not terribly pretty, but I think it'll give you the message. So baseline walking is bilateral elbow crutches, non-weight bearing, and the outcome after the intervention is somebody walking with an orthosis unaided. This isn't just about the orthosis, although it is important. It is also about core stability and gait training and other interventions. But it's not a cure for a situation like that, which tends to be chronic. But it is something that some individuals find is actually good enough for them to carry on with their lives, and it does what they want, and they opt out of the amputation. Another update from us that we've been talking about recently is naked prosthetics, partial hand prosthesis. You may have heard about, if you're familiar with partial hand amputation and partial finger amputations, then you'll know that historically there haven't been many options. There have been cosmetic options, there have been some complex and not overly reliable body-powered options, and there have been the externally powered options along the lines of eye-limb digits. But the eye-limb digits historically have been for a high level of amputation. So naked prosthetic devices are actually a very powerful and very useful practical device. If you want something that looks like a finger, then this isn't for you. But if you want something that intuitively, functionally provides quite a lot of assistance for the right group of people, then this is an option that needs to be seriously considered. Like many things, it's not for everybody, and the level of amputation is crucial. They are driven by the range of motion of the proximal joint, and therefore people need to have power and range of motion in the proximal joints to be able to make use of them. But when they work, they work phenomenally well. So it's worth bearing in mind. A few product updates we have had as well over the last few years. You may be familiar with Kinect's foot that we saw 2 or 3 years ago. We thought that was great. It was so good we started buying it and they all fell apart, and then it was taken off the market and it all ended in tears. Anyway, that's back now, and it is a good product that I think we'll see more of for sure. It has a huge range of motion at the ankle, that makes it quite unique from that point of view. But of course, like all these power devices, it is all microprocessor control devices at that level. It is quite big and it's reasonably heavy, but it is functionally good. And there's also a new version of the Ursa Proprio foot, which we like a lot. That has less range of motion and it's fixed during stance, but it adapts to terrain, and it dorsiflexes during swing face, which is a clever thing. You may not know what that means, but again, it's something we could explain to you in detail. Essentially, those microprocessor controlled feet and ankles, there's more of them now than there ever was, and their function is better, and it is worth considering for most people where the space is available for such devices, and you don't need to worry about the weight too much. So that's that. We were also going to talk about, as that update, osseointegration, TMR, targeted muscle innovation, neuromotors, pain treatment. You may have heard about that or seen some updates about that. And the O360 intensive rehabilitation program. I'm not going to dwell on that. I would encourage you, if you're interested, or if we had arranged to meet with you before this all started, then get back to us, or we'll reorganize it some other day. It's well worth doing to keep on top of what's going on in the world. Going from who we are and the updates that we intended to provide, let's talk about PACE and the coronavirus. I have a bit of history here because it sets the scene for us and in relation to where we are and where we've been and where we're going to go next. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. If you're like me, you will have followed the news broadcasts and paid a lot of attention to this because it means a lot. What we can and can't do means a lot to our business. We need to be active, but we also need to be responsible. So it's kind of a fine line to thread. And I just want to talk you through how we have arrived at where we are now. The coronavirus, we started hearing about it in December and January. It was kind of a vague flu-like thing, nothing terribly specific, and people wondered what the fuss was all about. It grew and grew and grew, and I remember going to Birmingham with Scott, my colleague, on the 9th of March 2020. That was my last official day out. By that time, there were extra people at Birmingham New Street when I went home that evening, wiping down the escalator handrails, and there wasn't a hand sanitizer to be bought for love nor money. It was just the beginning of a big change, and you could really feel that. Expressions like self-isolation were introduced, and at PACE we were kind of scratching our heads and trying to figure out what this was all about and how we should conduct ourselves. At that point, primarily to reduce or minimize the risk of service disruption, we structured our staff to a large degree in an A team and a B team. So we had people that we intended not to overlap, thereby minimizing the risk of infection within the team, so to speak. I think that lasted for all of 2 days or something like that. We established the team, and then within the next day or so, we had Boris on the television. It was 23rd of March. It was a Monday evening, I think, if I remember correctly. And he said then that you must stay at home, and people will only be allowed to leave home for the following very limited purposes: shopping for basic necessities, 1 form of exercise a day, any medical need, to provide care, and travel to and from work, but only where this is absolutely necessary and cannot be done from home. That's all. Those were his words. So we had to reconcile that medical need thing, which seemed to apply to us, with what people could travel for, and the fact that we should all be working from home where we could, but clearly you can't be a clinician from home, and all those kinds of things. So we started putting some measures in place for that. But it didn't end there. The week after, more things happened, and effectively the country was shut down, and that was the beginning of what we now call lockdown, I guess. Shops, cafes, pubs, bars, restaurants closed as soon as reasonably possible and asked not to open again. So that was a very strange time. And as we were getting these messages in the evening, I remember we were talking to each other within the management team and trying to figure out, should we ask people to stay home, should we ask them to come in, or what do we do? Do we cancel clinics and so on and so forth? And in the early stages, there was precious little guidance to be getting, but actually very quickly, we became avid readers of the government's website, the COVID-19 support page, and also Public Health England's Resource Centre. And in addition to that, if you look at your screen on the bottom right, you'll see the HCPC, CSP, PAPO, ISPO. These are all professional organisations and industry organisations that provide industry-specific advice for different professions. So that's the Health and Care Professions Council, the Chartered Society of Physiotherapists, British Association of Prosthetics and Orthotists, the International Society of Prosthetics and Orthotics, and there's more and more and more. We read it all, and we concluded that in some ways it was all the same thing, said in different ways and in different levels of detail. Wherever we looked, it was clear that we had a big responsibility ourselves. We felt initially that we should stay open to a degree, and we did that, and it didn't take terribly long before guidance came out that said that whilst retail services, and we were peculiarly, we classed as a retail service in this, most retail is closed, but if you look at that highlighted section, it mentions dental services, opticians, chiropractors, medical or health services to stay open. So we that kind of in our heads that ticked the box that yes, we were doing the right thing. We should be open, but we should be really careful. So we just carried on working on that. Well, obviously, it wasn't normal in any way or shape or form. Lots of people we were looking after, we felt we shouldn't be seeing because they were perhaps vulnerable, or they were not in a situation where we had an urgent situation to see them. And so from that point of view, we decided that we were standing some people down, and as a result of that, we also had to furlough some staff. That's a new expression for us. I never knew that existed, but we all now know about the furlough scheme. The whole social distancing, hand washing and sanitizer galore, looking at personal protective equipment, we went through all that stuff, and also we did risk assessments and put in place infrastructure for people to work from home, which I think is what everybody has done, and no doubt quite a few of you watching this are at home as well. In terms of our interactions with the public, we assessed the active episodes on the basis of necessity, what is necessary to do. And so there would be some things that we could do by couriers if we had routine maintenance or service provision, service of knee joints, those kinds of things. We may be able to do that. There has been an element of drive-through provision, vulnerable people turning up in the car park and handing things over, and us going in and doing something, decontaminating the device, doing what we need to do, decontaminating it again, and then handing it back, and people driving off. We have obviously, like everybody else, learned a lot about video conferencing fairly quickly. And where possible, we have just avoided being face-to-face with people. In relation to people who were not in high-risk populations, we have seen episodes through using those regular social distancing measures and internal systems. In terms of the remote services that we have developed, we have used all the apps that are available, really. We have tried to use what people are comfortable with for assessments, consultations, exercise programs, psychological support. And we have also been sharing some well-being and fitness tips by social media. The whole mental well-being, we know, has been a big thing, and it has been well publicized in the news as well. in terms of the people we have seen in clinic. Picture in the top corner there, which is absolutely what we used to do all the time, getting close and intimate with people in front of them. There's none of that going on now without PPE. So we maintain our distance when we can. If we do need to examine or palpate or try a device on, then we don all the gear. And the clinic room effectively becomes a quarantined area. So we go in, we don the PPE, we do the business, we take it off, we go out. And then when we come back in, we do the whole thing again. So everything takes at least twice as long as it normally does, but at least it's getting the job done. And for now, we're operating with reduced capacity and throughput anyway, so it kind of works okay. And I suppose we have, if you look at the guidance, then we are strictly speaking taking this too seriously, because the guidance we follow relates to potential cases of COVID, and potential cases of COVID normally in most circumstances are people who display symptoms that may be associated with a COVID-19 infection. In our case, of course, we're screening them before they come in. We're checking that they don't have any symptoms, but nevertheless, when they come in, we treat them as if they might be a carrier of the virus. So we're comfortable with that. These are things that are going on. Already mentioned some of that. Single-use clinic. We dedicate a clinic room per clinician for now, where that clinician is responsible for maintaining the cleanliness of that room for the day, if you like. So wiping it down before and after patients come and go, hand washing and leaving all the contact and wiping down all the contact surfaces associated with that patient's journey in the building. And of course, we have special arrangements on a daily basis with our regular cleaners, so they are focusing primarily on contact surfaces more than they normally would. We wear PPE and gloves for handling devices, and we wipe them all down. And we restrict the environment where we actually handle and work on devices to not necessarily a sealed room, but a controlled environment where we have glass surfaces that can be wiped down. There's nothing sticking to anything, and it's quite an elaborate process. That's with the existing patients where we have ongoing treatment happening. For new patients, we have accepted referrals, and we have carried on assessing people remotely. One thing that we absolutely didn't want to do is to kind of stop seeing people altogether. We didn't want to put things on hold fully. We didn't want to, if you like, refuse a referral now in order to deal with it later. So when people have been in touch, and I would encourage everybody to carry on doing this, is to get to know, to get in touch with us, and we'll figure out a way to at least get to know somebody, have a provisional conversation with somebody, maybe be able to have a look at what their current devices are, how they present, get a rough idea of what's involved, so we can then plan input and costs. And the same thing applies to our current patients where there is no current episode going on. So we can review them remotely, and we can plan future activities and make further recommendations. And the same thing applies to medical legal assessments. We have been carrying out medical legal assessments. In my opinion, it works quite well. We can get 70% of what we need from most remote assessments, and then focus at the end on the actual physical examination, and that will verify or perhaps change our opinion a little bit when it comes to doing that. But essentially, this is working well, and I would encourage everybody to not hesitate to refer people at this point, because we'll be able to work with them. I think it's fair to say that almost all services have had activity and remained active. The orthotics have been on hold largely because of the furloughing situation, but they're due to start back up again. We've had like a skeleton, an emergency cover for orthotics really. Apart from that, we're happy that we've had good level of services from the other professions, and it's worked well, but within this environment that I've just described to you. And as an example of the services we have been providing and how that has been conducted, I'm just going to hand you over to Karen now, who's our psychologist, and she is she's going to talk to us about psychology and psychology services. So Karen, you're on.
Hi, my name's Karen Mead. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I joined PACE in July 2019. That was primarily at the request of the team, who had really noticed that there'd been some difficulties with the engagement at times of some of the patients that were coming to see the team at PACE. So sometimes there were difficulties with people perhaps disengaging in their treatment. Perhaps they were not showing up to appointments, or they were cancelling frequently at short notice. Sometimes people were forgetting a lot of the physiotherapy input, or just forgetting information that had been discussed in their consultations. And the team very rightly picked up that this was at times getting in the way of somebody's improvement and their rehab, along with their overall well-being. So at the request of the team, I came across to work with PACE, and since that time we've been looking at all new patients that are coming in to work with PACE, and each patient, when they come to PACE for assessment, will do a psychology well-being screen. That's really useful, as it allows us to get a bit of a sense of where people are psychologically when they're coming to work with the team, and helps to pick up any underlying pre-existing mental health conditions or difficulties they may have, so we can actually get in quite quickly and start working with our patients to help improve their well-being, help improve their mood, help improve their engagement in the rehabilitation process. So a little bit about my background is I've had quite a bit of experience working with amputees before I came to PACE. So I've had a lot of experience as the former national head of service at Help the Heroes. I've led Invictus team, psych screening and psych wellbeing, and I've worked in physical health and psychological trauma settings for many, many years. So I guess I seem like a good fit to come in to PACE and to help set this service up. When COVID hit, it obviously, I think we all know how it impacted on us as individuals. And it was quite interesting looking back at the measures that were in place at the time that actually identified the severity of the impact of going into lockdown had on people's mental health, their psyche, their mood, their sleep, their overall level of function. So there's just a little graph here in front of you that actually shows the dark blue lines show people's rates of depression the day before the lockdown announcement was called into place. The second column next to it shows people's rates of depression and anxiety. So the orange columns there actually shows a huge spike in the prevalence of depression and anxiety reported by this is the general population in Britain the day after the lockdown was announced. So you can see a massive spike in how people were feeling depressed, anxious, stressed, and the 1 month follow-up is the powder purple, I guess the light purple color there, that actually shows there's been a significant reduction back down in levels of depression and anxiety amongst the general population, but they haven't actually returned to the pre-lockdown levels. What that tells us is that people are still carrying around a great deal of stress, anxiety, worry, low mood, because of the situation that we're all in. It's not a normal situation by any stretch of the imagination. And I think we've all experienced directly firsthand the impact it probably had at times on our sleep, our mood, our motivation, our general energy levels, our relationships, and how we're feeling within ourselves. And what we know from the research that has been conducted internationally, so there's some quite big, large cohort studies that are looking internationally, trying to understand the actual impact that COVID has had on global mental health. And there's some key themes that are actually coming up. which is particularly relevant for the patients that we see at PACE. But just mentioning some of the key ones, we know that those with chronic illness are at particularly high risk of having increased rates of depression, increased rates of anxiety, more anger, more irritability, and general poorer psychological well-being. So chronic illness can obviously be, if you think about people that have had amputations, it can be amongst people who have diabetes, cardiopulmonary disease, respiratory conditions, individuals that have had long-term cancer. And obviously that can happen in our patient group, particularly for those who have had amputations for health reasons in some way or other. Those that are living alone are also at increased risk. Those who are in cities and higher density areas have a higher risk about the impact on their mental health. Those with pre-existing mental health conditions, and I'm going to get to that in a couple of slides, explaining why that's a key area of concern for the patients that we see through PACE, because many of them are at increased risk of mental health conditions before COVID-19 became a thing. Those also on lower incomes, so in particular thinking about those perhaps who may be waiting on payouts through legal claims, who aren't working. These are all people that we know are at increased risk of quite severe impact on their mental health due to lockdown, shielding, and just the constant stress and worry about the situation that's going on outside. So being quite specific, the things that I've noticed in my one-to-one work with patients through PACE is many of those have been impacted by delays to either their initial surgery or a revision surgery, and as well as follow-up and things like that. Many of them have been quite anxious and distressed, feeling quite unsteady and uncertain about how is my rehab and my recovery going to look. Because there's no timelines at the moment. We actually we don't know when people are going to be able to have their surgeries. We don't know when people are necessarily going to be able to get in and have face-to-face appointments at the moment. So that has been quite destabilizing and very anxiety provoking for many of the patients that we work with. In particular, I just want to mention those who had made a decision to have an amputation and then had that surgery cancelled. They are still living with the reasons that that motivated them in the first place to have an amputation, if it was an elective amputation. So they're still living with conditions around chronic pain and difficulties with mobility, disfigured limbs, which for many people, they feel actually are no longer part of their body. They quite often can be talking about just wanting to kind of get rid of it and feeling like that limb is actually their enemy. It's doing them no good. So they're kind of forced to continue living with something that's very, very distressing. Many, again, I mentioned, have comorbid physical health conditions, and we know that places them at increased risk, not only psychologically, but actually increased risk of contracting and having very serious impact if they do get COVID-19. In particular, people with respiratory conditions, again, diabetes, those who've had cancer or have been on any sort of treatment that's required steroids to shrink down immune response, they're all at increased risk, and the levels of stress and anxiety for those individuals is enormous. Also, for a lot of our amputees and our PACE patients, there's been huge changes to their routine above and beyond what would have been an impact for most of us in our day-to-day lives. For them, many of their routines was actually they weren't working. Instead, all their energy and time was focused in coming in and actually going through rehab and their prosthetic appointments, and that was their sole focus. And for many, it has been quite distressing to feel like their rehab is almost put on hold, which is a big part of the reason why the work that PACE has been doing has been very much trying to keep people moving forward and progressing and finding alternative ways to allow people to engage in their physiotherapy appointments, for example. It's been a very, very important part of people's mental health as well, to keep rehab going for those individuals. Sleep is another one which has been massively impacted, again, for all of us, but for those with amputations or are considering amputation, sleep has been really exacerbated for many who had underlying trauma conditions. They've really had more difficulties with their sleep. They've had more extreme nightmares. They've had more distressing themes around lack of control. So sleep has actually been quite considerably impacted. Again, we've all had difficulty accessing food and getting deliveries done, but for many people who may have had a physical injury but don't meet the shielding criteria, they may actually have difficulty getting food into their home because they can't get priority food deliveries. So that's, again, another real big stressor for many people. And for anybody that's had either an amputation or has been thinking about an amputation, who has had a chronic health condition leading up to COVID-19, we know that their psychological reserves are already under strain and have been for quite a considerable time. And that is due to the alarm state in our brain being left switched on much longer than it naturally would do so. This alarm system is purely designed to be a short-term fight-flight emergency response, but for many people who we've come to PACE, these alarm systems have been left switched on for a lot longer than they're designed to fit, being already prone to being quite exhausted, physically run down. So COVID-19 has really had some quite significant impact on those who experience amputation. The good news is there's quite a lot of work that we've been continuing to do, and that's delivering support to our patients around particularly a lot of what we call acceptance and commitment therapy approaches. So helping people to focus on what's within their control, helping people to focus on the small achievable things that they can do. There's a lot of cognitive strategies that allow us to help people, instead of getting caught up in anxiety thoughts, to be able to zone in, reframe, refocus, and start to focus on what they are capable of doing. And also help to take some of the sting out of what we call catastrophizing or catastrophic thinking. So a big part of my role has been helping to hold, contain, and support our patients to keep going with their rehab as well, keep their motivation levels up, which is really tricky in the current environment, but so many of them have been doing such a great job at keeping going and keeping motivated. What we do know about our PACE patients, before COVID-19 started, when I joined in July last year, we started to screen all of our patients for their overall sort of general mental health condition. And what we found amongst the population of amputees is that actually they're already at increased risk of underlying mental health condition. So for our PACE population, there was over 55% that met caseness, what we call caseness. It's the threshold, the cut-off criteria, where somebody goes to having what we call subclinical symptoms to clinical symptoms of either depression or anxiety, for example. It's basically the cut-off point where we say, actually, this person is clinically unwell and this is a diagnosable mental health condition. So we know that 55% of our cases were coming to us already experiencing clinical levels of depression, and that's above what would be we would expect in the broader British population, where the rates of depression are 19.7%, so significantly higher. Again, with anxiety, the rates that people were coming to us with were actually very, very high at 68%, when you compare it to the normal prevalence rate in the general population of only 7.8% in the British community. So you can tell there's actually quite a big difference there in people. When we talk about anxiety, we're not just talking about general anxiety, but we can be talking about phobias, obsessive compulsive behaviors, post-traumatic stress, and other types of specific phobia or general phobia. Some of this is actually around health phobia and health anxiety as well. So 68% is very, very high percentage of the amputees we were seeing that were feeling clinically anxious. Post-traumatic stress, this is the one that seems to get a lot of the attention, but actually when you look at normal data for the general population, PTSD, or as we call it, we would only expect about 3% in the general British population. But amongst those coming to PACE, we have 50% who screened as probably having PTSD, as in it's anticipated from a brief screening measure that actually they were probably likely to meet criteria for PTSD. So you can see that people's mental health when they've had an amputation or when they're considering an amputation is actually already, again, kind of going back to what I was talking about, they were already struggling with some significant mental health challenges along the way. And this was before COVID impacted on them. Another key measure that we look at is actually the World Health Organization Quality of Life measure. And this is a beautiful measure because it actually captures people's well-being and how they are feeling, across different domains in their life. So first of all, we look at their physical, their psychological, their social, and their environmental quality of life and their rating. So this red line that you can see across the top of the graph here is the 60% bar, which we aim for. It's considered a kind of very general baseline measure of where we hope that people that are in that should be about 60% or over in terms of how they rate their quality of life. We know that people that fall significantly below that bar tend to have poorer mental health outcomes. So again, this is when patients were first coming to PACE. You can see that their physical quality of life was a lot below that 60%. So these blue columns there are all of the new patients that we had coming to us. And the orange columns are actually, I've broken that down into those that were pre-amputation, just because I thought it was interesting. This is obviously people that have yet to go through the amputation process, but have often been living with chronic pain and mobility issues for a long period of time. So you can see that both physical and psychological quality of life in all of these patients, general and pre-amputees, was significantly below that 60% bar. The social quality of life actually amongst those that were considering amputation was pretty good, as was the environmental for those general that were coming to us. It's quite interesting to see that amputees seem to be almost doing, the pre-amputees seem to be doing quite well when it came to their social quality of life, and perhaps that may be due to many of those that attended PACE actually came with somebody. They had a partner or a family member with them. So they did seem to be quite well supported socially before they went through the amputation process. But the key areas you can see there is physical and psychological well-being are drastically below where we would like things to be for people. So my role within the psychology service is, first and foremost, is to provide support across the entire multidisciplinary team and to provide input, guidance, a space sometimes to kind of bounce ideas around. And that can be really, really useful in terms of helping potentially pick up problems early. So it's not unusual for one of the members of our team, whether it's a physio or a prosthetist, to actually have a chat to me, raising concerns, maybe about somebody not showing up to their appointments or cancelling, or perhaps they've got a brand new prosthesis which they don't seem to be engaging with very much. So a big part of my role is actually helping to support the rest of the clinicians at PACE to improve engagement and improve outcomes for all of the patients that we see. I also provide direct psychological input, whether that's for individuals or partners and families. And quite often that's around traumatic reactions, body image, depression, anxiety, helping people to with the transition and the adjustment from being injured to being an amputee, and then starting to imagine and have clarify their vision of how they want their life to move forward. So it's not only working with those who have what we would call a diagnosable mental health condition, but it's also working with those that actually might be feeling pretty good in themselves, but actually they want assistance and support to go that extra step. So sometimes it's around providing support for improving performance. Sometimes it's around helping people to improve their goal setting and their motivation, perhaps to achieve higher than what they had thought they originally could as an amputee. So a big part of this is about building resilience and promoting this sense that actually we can support you to kind of go forward in whatever direction you choose to. Once we've got you sort of physically up and running. So that's a big part of the scope of what we provide. We're also providing support, pre-amputation support, to many patients that have expressed concern, confusion, uncertainty around whether or not they wish to go through an amputation. That's seems to be a big area of need, which at the moment seems to be unmet. So many of the patients that I speak to who are pre-amputation with PACE have felt a little bit isolated trying to make the decision. They may have all the medical information, but they actually often want space to think about and to weigh up their options, which is something that we can provide. I also provide specialist training, not just for staff, but for other teams, whether that's medical teams or legal teams, just around considering the psychological aspects of working with amputees or those who have gone through severe injury. And that's something I can do on a bespoke ground if people are interested. But alongside that, we're also doing data capture to build our understanding of this particular patient group. There's still not a huge amount of information out there. As somebody that's spent a lot of time working with military populations, I'm acutely aware that there's a huge amount of research around military amputees, but a little less so when it comes to civilian amputees. So we're hoping to build the general knowledge base around that, really, and help contribute to that understanding of how best to target services and support the needs of our patients. So this is just one little example of how input from psychology alongside the prosthetic and the physio recovery of a PACE patient can actually improve outcomes. So the first measures across the bottom, we have the GAD is an anxiety measure, the PHQ is a depression measure, and the DAR is an anger measure. And what you can see is the blue is the pre-score, so when somebody first came to PACE, and this is after 10 sessions of psychological input with myself. You can see that the anxiety scores, the depression scores, and the anger scores have all fallen. What you can't see from that is that each of those, across each of those domains, that individual no longer meets clinical caseness, clinical diagnostic criteria for a chronic anxiety, depression, or anger condition anymore. So they are now no longer meeting the criteria to be diagnosed with depression, anxiety, or a chronic anger difficulty. That's after 10 sessions of input. You can also see, moving across their quality of life measures, where people's physical and psychological scores at the beginning were, again, below that 60% where we're aiming for. You can see a physical well-being, and this patient wasn't finished their physical rehab with PACE yet at the time this was done. So they're at the 56th percentile, so just under the 60, and you can see this particular patient's quality of life for his psychological well-being has really skyrocketed up to 88th percentile, which is fantastic. I think for any of us, I'd be quite happy if mine was at the 88th percentile all the time. So you can see quite significant improvements. His social quality of life had improved as well. And his environmental quality of life hadn't changed, because one of the key issues for this chap was actually he wanted to move home, and he's still awaiting on his legal settlement to do so. So that remained unchanged. But you can see there's been quite a positive improvement in this gentleman's psychological well-being as a result of integrating psychology input alongside the normal MDT offer. Thinking about those with pre-amputation needs, we know that of those pre-amputees that have come to PACE, and I talk about pre-amputees as in those who are considering having an amputation, because they don't all go on to have an amputation, some opt for other options. 100% of those have actually requested psychology input and psychology support, because they're feeling like that is something that they are not getting as easily. necessarily from other providers. So it's a very busy and growing part of the service that we offer is supporting those who are considering amputation. So I guess I'm a big believer in early intervention and preventative practice. So the sooner we can get people in, actually I can start to prepare people for considering how they may cope with even choosing not to have an amputation or choosing to have the amputation, and I can start to psychologically help them to prepare for that. So that's a little bit about the service and the scope of what I've been offering with PACE. And now I'm just going to hand back, I believe, to Toby, who's going to continue talking.
We've talked about how we've ended up in this situation and how we have adjusted to our new environment, and Karen told us about psychological services that have obviously been important in this situation, because people are isolated whether they have to or not. It's difficult to keep in touch. For now, we're being asked to return to work when we can in a safe environment. We've been allowed to socialise in pairs and undertake some activities that we couldn't do before, like fishing and tennis, I think, and things like that. So there's been a bit of easing of the restrictions. There is a planned second step to come in June, when some shops and schools will be open, or some aspects of schooling. And the third step is in July, when the hospitality industry and public places may be open again, subject to scientific advice. When we look closer at the guidance that follows with that, we find that we are now all being asked to adjust our working arrangements to provide, as an employer, we have to provide a COVID secure environment. And there is actually a badge that we can claim. It's a self-certification process that we can claim to be COVID secure. It will apply to, of course, our employees as well as the public. That's when they access our services. And what we're hoping to do is to achieve that status, which we are a long way towards already, having worked on this already, but to be able to formally claim that badge early July, and then gradually start to rebuild the clinical services from the 8th of June, which is a week later. And of course, this is subject to what happens between now and then, whether the R value depends, jumps or drops or what, but we'll see. But that's our plan. So we're hoping to gradually, in a controlled manner, get back to business. We are keen to avoid a big backlog. We have tried to keep on top of assessments and medical legal report provision as well. We don't particularly want people to wait with referring to us until everything is free. We want the opportunity and the ability to plan ahead, because this is going to be tricky. We have several people who are furloughed, as I said before. We need to gradually bring them back. We need to build capacity and build resources in a controlled manner. And we're also mindful of the fact that the NHS will have a big backlog when it comes to services that relate to our caseload. So it may well be that some of our patients who would normally depend on the NHS for some of their services will not be able to do so. So I guess my message to you, my take-home message to you, is that if you have anybody that you are considering referring to us, then talk to us early. And the worst thing that can happen is that we say, actually, we can't deal with that just yet, but we will as soon as we can. What is likely to happen is that we schedule in an appointment or an assessment of some sort that we can deal with in the near future, if not in the immediate future. And that's the end of my presentation here. I have one question from the floor. And if we should, Karen, do you want to join me? Is it a very prosthetic? Okay, we have a couple of questions here. The question is, how are we actually measuring for new prosthesis remotely? What information do we need from us as referring case managers? We need a referral with background information. So we would like to know a bit about the history of the individual. But we don't actually need that much. We're not going to be measuring somebody for a new prosthesis. What we will do is go a long way towards establishing a spec, and based on that spec we will be able to provide costs. Sometimes we can do that very confidently, and we can give you a pro forma invoice and say pay this and we'll be on the way. Sometimes it will be subject to further physical assessment later on, but we'll make that call when we talk to the individual. The reality is that the dimensions of an individual is actually quite a small part of the assessment. A lot of the information you get from a person is verbal, and we try hard to make the most of that. Another question here, which is, in the absence of being able to come and visit PACE, will you be offering any webinars about advancements in prosthetics and any information about prosthetics and technology available from you that I might be able to obtain from a visit? The answer to that question is that we will be doing, depending on what feedback we get from this webinar, we may be doing it again. I don't think that we will be doing any very detailed technology or product or service updates over the web, other than perhaps if we, because it's a bit generic, it's a bit difficult to be generic. Then it could be that we set up a session with an individual organisation and talk to them about specifically what they want. We're hoping that if you're not in the risk category come June or July, that you will be able to, we have the COVID safe badge. You as individuals feel that you are able to travel, that we will be able to see you physically. But of course, if that's not possible, then we'll do our best to accommodate it. But in terms of prosthetics and technology, I think we'll do that referrer by referrer or individual by individual, rather than an open webinar like this. This has been an open invitation largely, and it becomes a little bit too generic, I think, to be talking about technological specifics. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you had well, I hope it was useful. I hope you have a good rest of the day and week, and hope to see you soon.